I did not come here to ask for help or permission. I came to demand justice for Africa and to remind the world of debts that must be repaid. With those words, on September 17, 2025, at exactly 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the young president of Burkina Faso, took the podium at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. What followed may one day be remembered as a defining moment in modern history. Most speeches delivered at the UN fade into obscurity within hours. But this one did not. From the first words, there was a sense of tension in the air. Something different, something historic. Traore had not come to make polite appeals or to ask for aid. He came armed with facts, history, and conviction. With calm precision, he accused the United Nations of being dominated by the same Western powers that once colonized Africa and extracted its wealth for centuries. His words were sharp, yet his tone was composed. He was not pleading for sympathy. He was delivering a verdict. And he made it clear, he was not speaking for Burkina Faso alone. He was speaking for an entire continent, 1.4 billion people whose patience had run out. The reaction in the chamber revealed the gravity of the moment. Normally, UN speeches end with brief applause and quiet exit. But this time, something extraordinary happened. Over 30 African delegations rose to their feet in unison. Their applause lasted for 12 uninterrupted minutes, joined soon by representatives from China, India, Russia, and Brazil. Across the aisle, Western diplomats remained seated, motionless, their silence as revealing as the thunderous applause that surrounded them. For the first time in decades, the balance of moral and political power inside the UN chamber seemed to shift. This was not another African appeal for fairness. It was a direct challenge to the international order built after World War II. Traore's speech raised a question that echoed across the hall. Can a global system designed by a handful of victorious nations in 1945 still claim to represent fairness in 2025? Many believe that day marked the moment Africa and the broader global South told the world that the old order could no longer stand. When Traore approached the podium, he looked nothing like the traditional head of state. He wore his military uniform, not a tailored suit. His posture was disciplined, his eyes unwavering. He spoke like a commander addressing history itself. This visual alone carried meaning. He came not to negotiate, but to confront. Most world leaders attend the UN hoping to win favor with the powerful nations that dominate global institutions. Traore, by contrast, appeared indifferent to approval. His composure reflected confidence, his words, precision. He presented his argument not as a political speech but as a legal case. Evidence, data, history, each point built upon the last. For nearly 47 minutes, he dissected how the United Nations had failed Africa and much of the global South. It was created to protect peace, he reminded them, yet in practice it preserved the privileges of the same countries that once ruled through empire. He pointed to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, and China, and reminded everyone that their veto power existed not because of moral authority, but because they won a war 8 decades ago. His tone never rose. His voice never wavered. But every word landed with precision and weight. This was not charity he demanded. It was justice. And that distinction transformed the atmosphere of the hall. Then came the number that stunned the world. $847 billion. That figure, he said, represented the amount that France owed Burkina Faso since its independence in 1960. A figure calculated by African economists and legal experts, backed by historical records. Traore detailed how France had forced African nations to deposit half their foreign reserves into the French treasury under the CFA franc system, effectively keeping them in economic dependency. He described how French corporations purchased African gold, cotton, and uranium at artificial prices, only to sell finished goods back to Africa at a profit. This, he said, was not partnership, it was theft, hidden under the cover of diplomacy. Each number, each contract, each example turned colonialism from an abstract historical grievance into a precise financial debt. The call for $847 billion was not only about restitution, it was about dignity. It transformed centuries of suffering into something quantifiable, undeniable, and due. For France, the implications were enormous. For Africa, the symbolism was liberating. For the first time, colonial exploitation was not just a story, it was an invoice. As Traore concluded, the chamber erupted again. 32 African delegations rose to their feet. They clapped, they cheered, they stood shoulder to shoulder. The ovation lasted 12 minutes, an eternity in diplomatic time. Soon, representatives from China, Russia, India, Brazil, Cuba, and Venezuela joined in. It was more than applause, it was a declaration of solidarity. The global South was no longer divided or cautious. It was united, demanding change. Across the hall, the Western Bloc remained seated, stiff and silent. Their stillness carried its own message. They had been confronted with truths they could neither deny nor dismiss. Behind closed doors, Western diplomats scrambled. Calls were made. Emergency meetings convened. Statements were drafted. Yet their challenge was clear. None had refuted the $847 billion claim. They called it political theater, populism, exaggeration, but offered no counterfigures, no alternative data. Their silence on the details was as telling as their discomfort. For once, the West was not leading the conversation. It was reacting to it. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the streets erupted in celebration. Thousands gathered in Ouagadougou to watch the speech replayed on screens. Flags waved, drums echoed, and the phrase, 847 billion, became a chant of pride. For ordinary Africans, this was not just about economics. It was about recognition. For generations, they had seen their resources extracted while their nations remained underdeveloped. Now, someone had stood before the world and demanded the truth be acknowledged. Across Africa, the media called it the day Africa spoke. Social networks flooded with praise. Young people hailed Traore as a new Thomas Sankara, the visionary who once dreamed of a self-reliant Africa. Discussions about reparations and economic independence filled universities, radio stations, and community halls. It was no longer just a speech. It had become a movement. The ripple spread beyond Africa. In Latin America, Venezuela and Cuba praised the speech as a stand against neo-colonial injustice. In Asia, India and China voiced support, calling for reform in global institutions. In Iran, Vietnam, and across South Asia, debates reignited about the lingering costs of colonialism. Nations that had once been exploited saw in Traore's words a mirror of their own histories. From Havana to New Delhi, a conversation was taking shape, a shared realization that the global South no longer needed to wait for permission to lead. But no country felt the shock more deeply than France. In West Africa, French embassies were surrounded by protesters demanding repayment. "Pay back our money," the banners read. Contracts with French firms stalled, investigations opened, and the political temperature rose. In Paris, emergency meetings stretched late into the night. Officials understood that this was not just a diplomatic dispute. It was an existential challenge to France's long-standing influence over its former colonies. If Burkina Faso succeeded, other nations would follow. The quiet mechanisms that kept Africa economically tied to Europe were being exposed, and the entire system trembled under scrutiny. As the world absorbed the shock, attention turned toward one date, December 15, 2025. On that day, leaders from across Africa, Asia, and Latin America were scheduled to meet in Ouagadougou for what they called the Global South Assembly. Over 60 nations expressed interest, including China, Russia, India, and Iran. Even smaller countries, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Algeria, confirmed attendance. The goal: to design a new international framework. One without veto powers. One where each nation had an equal voice. For historians, the comparison was immediate: the Bandung Conference of 1955, when newly independent nations first met to build the non-aligned movement. But this time, the stakes were even higher. The Global South Assembly was not just about neutrality. It was about rewriting the global system itself. For Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked country with no skyscrapers or nuclear arsenal, Hosting such a gathering marked a symbolic transformation. Ouagadougou had become the center of a new world conversation. In Washington, reactions were cautious. Publicly, U.S. officials warned that creating alternative institutions could fragment global cooperation. Privately, internal reports expressed alarm. Analysts warned that if Africa and the Global South united, the U.S. could lose significant influence in trade, diplomacy, and security. For 70 years, the United States had shaped the post-war order through the UN, NATO, and the World Bank. Now, that system was being challenged at its foundations. The question confronting policymakers was simple: adapt or resist, reform or risk irrelevance. Traore's speech reflected a broader reality. The world is no longer bipolar or unipolar. It is multipolar. Power is no longer concentrated in a handful of capitals. It is diffusing to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America. A new generation of leaders is demanding not inclusion as beneficiaries, but equality as partners. This transformation is not only political, it is philosophical. For decades, the old order justified itself through stability. Now, stability itself is being redefined, not as the dominance of a few, but as fairness among many. A multipolar world means no single country dictates the rules. It means shared responsibility and mutual respect. For Africa and the Global South, this is not a slogan, it is survival. It is the assertion that sovereignty must finally mean independence in both name and practice. For generations, African leaders approached global power with caution, speaking softly, asking for reform, requesting aid. Most of those requests were ignored or reshaped to serve others' interests. But September 17, 2025, marked the end of that era. Traore did not ask for permission. He demanded accountability. He presented receipts, named the amount, and set the terms. If justice was denied, he warned Africa would walk, not just out of the UN chamber, but out of the world system that had failed it. That was the true turning point. The transition from pleading to demanding, from dependence to defiance. For many across Africa, that moment became a source of pride. For the rest of the world, it was a signal, a reminder that the future will not be written by a few, but by many. In just 47 minutes, Captain Ibrahim Traore accomplished what few have done. He exposed centuries of injustice with evidence, demanded reparations with precision, and outlined a vision of a fairer future. His speech was not merely rhetoric. It was a declaration of independence for an entire continent, and perhaps for half the world. Some in the West dismissed it as theater. But theater does not inspire a 12-minute standing ovation. It does not unite 32 nations or draw the attention of billions across 3 continents. And it certainly does not force emergency meetings. 17-2025**. The day Africa stopped asking for permission and began demanding justice. The world is changing. And this time, the future will not be written by the few, but by the many.